How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chafei, Daf 25 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, on Daf 25 of Masechta Chullin, it might feel in some ways similar to like recent Dafs, new content, but somewhat similar vibe / template of comparing different things, and what's tahor for this is tamei for that, and what's vices for this is versa for that. And anyways, so we're going to have, I think, 3 Mishnayos today, comparing different things. Shouldn't be too difficult, although it is Tuma and Tara for the first 2 of them. So, you know, that's usually just as a baseline is not an easy thing. But I hope it shouldn't be too difficult. I guess like a little bit of turbulence, but nothing too out of control is how I'm imagining things. So on the one hand, I feel like we should be able to move kind of quickly. On the other hand, there might be some things that need explanation. Now, the 3 Mishnayos are going to be, the first one is comparing earthenware vessels to other vessels, kli cheres versus other vessels. The next Mishnah will be comparing wooden vessels to metal vessels. What are the differences between clay eitz versus clay mateches? And finally, the third Mishnah will be comparing sweet almonds to bitter almonds. So, friends, this is what we have to look forward to on Daf Chafei of Masechta Chullin. Come, join me, let's enjoy ourselves and learn together Daf Chafei of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Chav Daled Amid Beis, about 10 or 15 lines from the bottom or so, at the Mishnah. Tar b'klei cheres tamei b'chol akelim, tar b'chol akelim tamei b'klei cheres, which translates to, that which is pure by earthenware vessels is impure by other vessels. That which is pure by other vessels is impure by earthenware vessels. Friends, what is going on over here? What it means is, when it comes to klei cheres, so what are we saying? We're saying Torah b'klei cheres, that which is pure when it comes to a klei cheres. Friends, who could tell me, when it comes to klei, first of all, what is klei cheres? It's earthenware vessels. Let's think about it. We'll use, I think, as an example on today's daf. Let's say you have an earthenware cookie jar. You have an earthenware cookie jar, a big cookie jar with a lid, and you open it up and you fill it up with chocolate chip cookies. That is our klei cheres. It's an earthenware cookie jar, for our example. So an earthenware vessel does not become tummy from its outside. So if you take a dead mouse and you touch the dead mouse to the outside of our earthenware cookie jar, so the cookie jar will remain as tahor as ever. It will be pure. So tahor b'klei cheres, that which is pure by klei cheres, i.e., if a dead sheretz touches the outside of an earthenware vessel, it is tahor. However, tamei b'chol akelim, if that cookie jar was made out of silver, for example, so the cookie jar would be a rishon l'tuma. If a dead sheretz were to touch a silver cookie jar, that cookie jar would be a rishon l'tuma, and it would be mitame, I imagine, just whatever cookies are touching the jar. Any cookies in the middle of the jar, which we're going to be talking about soon, any cookies in the middle of the jar, I imagine, would whatever. Meaning, if the dead sheretz touches the silver cookie jar becomes a rishon l'tuma, because the sheretz is an ava tuma. The cookie jar becomes a rishon l'tuma. Any cookies that are touching the cookie jar become a sheni l'tuma, but it be'etzim stops there. So any cookies that are touching those cookies would not become anything. As we're going to see in a Rashi soon, first of all, food is not, right? Ein ochlin mitami ochlin. Food is not mitami other food. Also, food sheni l'tuma doesn't make other ochlin. You only become a shlishi or vi if we're talking about truma or kachim, so something that we're not. Anyways, it's a different thing. So where are we? So when it comes to klei cheres, which are not mitami from the outside, by other vessels, however, they are mitami from the outside. And tahor b'chol akelim tamei b'klei cheres. And that which is tahor when it comes to other vessels, who could tell me what is tahor when it comes to other vessels? Well, say you have a silver cookie jar and you take a dead mouse and you tie a string around its back right leg and you dangle it into the silver cookie jar, not touching the cookie jar, not touching the cookies, just having fun. Taking a dead cherets, tying a little string, taking a dead mouse, tying a string to its back right foot, and just dangling it into our silver cookie jar. In that case, everything is tahor. There was no physical touching interaction between our dead mouse and our cookies or our cookie jar, our silver cookie jar. However, if we're talking about our earthenware cookie jar, it is a completely different story. If you take that dead mouse and you dangle it into the earthenware cookie jar, even though it doesn't touch anything, the cookie jar becomes a rishon latuma, which will then be metame all of the cookies in them, whether the cookies are touching the side of the jar or not. Even, right, so we said it's a very big cookie jar and it's filled up with lots and lots of cookies. And those cookies in the middle are touching other cookies, which are touching other cookies, which are maybe touching the jar. But nonetheless, all of them become tameh. So that is something that is unique to earthenware vessels, that by dangling the dead cherets into the earthenware vessel, even though nothing is touched, the vessel becomes tameh and the food inside the vessel becomes tameh. That does not apply to other scenarios like a silver cookie jar, okay? So the Mishnah had said that which is tahor by a klicheres, i.e. a dead cheret touching the outside of a klicheres, the klicheres is tahor. However, a dead cheret touching the outside of a silver cookie jar, so then the cookie jar will be tameh. Now, when it comes to dangling a klicheres inside of the cookie jar, if we're talking about an earthenware cookie jar, the cookie jar will be tameh, and the cookies will be tameh. If we're talking about a silver cookie jar, none of it will be tameh when you're simply dangling it inside. So again, tahor b'klicheres, that which is tahor by klicheres, i.e. a dead cheret touching the outside of the earthenware cookie jar, tameh b'chol hakelim would be tameh by other vessels like a silver cookie jar. Tahor b'chol hakelim, that which is tahor by other vessels, for example, dangling a dead mouse inside of a silver cookie jar is tahor. The cookie jar is tahor, the cookies are tahor, tameh b'klicheres. But if we're talking about our earthenware cookie jar, well, the cookie jar will be tameh and it will be mitameh the cookies inside. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, the Rabbi said, over klicheres, dangling a dead mouse into the inside of the earthenware cookie jar. And friends, when I talk about dangling the dead mouse inside of the cookie jar, I am talking about where it is not touching anything, not touching the cookie jar, not touching the cookies. Now that we've set that straight, if I talk about dangling a dead mouse into the cookie jar, that's what we're talking about. It's not touching anything, it's just dangling inside. So over kli cheres, so where am I? So Tana Rabbanan, so over kli cheres, dangling a dead mouse into a earthenware cookie jar, tameh, the cookie jar is tameh, v'gabo tahor. But if the dead mouse were to touch the outside of the earthenware cookie jar, it would be tahor. Now, when the dead mouse is dangled into the earthenware cookie jar and it becomes tameh, it entirely becomes tameh, including the outside. I mean, the inside becomes tameh, the outside becomes tameh. It is now a tameh vessel. So now if, food touches the earthenware vessel from the outside, it will become a sheni latuma, meaning if a dead cheret touches the outside of a klicheres, it remains tahor. If a dead cheret is dangled into the klicheres, and certainly if it falls to the bottom of the klicheres and actually touches the klicheres, that goes without saying. But even if the dead cheret is simply dangled into the klicheres becomes entirely tameh, inside, outside. And so now, if food touches the outside of the klicheres, now of course it's going to be a sheni latum. So now again, over klicheres, the airspace, the inside of a klicheres is tameh, v'gabo, but if a dead cheret touches the outside of the klicheres is tahor. Over kol hakelim tahor, the insides of all, dangling inside any other type of vessel is tahor, so long as it doesn't touch the vessel or anything in it. V'gabon tamei. But if a dead sheretz touches the outside of any of these other vessels, then the vessel will be tamei. Nimtza tahor b'kli cheres tamei b'chol hakelim. So what we see is that which is tahor by the kli cheres, i.e. the outside of the vessel, tamei b'chol hakelim, is impure by all of the other vessels. Tahor b'chol hakelim, that which is pure by the other vessels, i.e. dangling a dead sheretz inside of it, tamei b'kli cheres, is tamei by a kli cheres. And I'm going to take a shluck of water. We're going to go weiter. Now says the Gemara, Minan Emili. How do we know this? This is important. This is like a yesodistic thing, and we're learning here on Daf Chav Daled Masechta Chullin. Minan Emili. How do we know this? The Tanu Rabban and the rabbis taught Tocho. Okay, so if we look at our pasuk, this is the Perek Yud Aleph of Sefer Vayikra, pasuk Yud Zayin. No. Pasuk Lamed Gimel. V'chol kli cheres, I'm reading you the pasuk. V'chol kli cheres, any earthenware cookie jar, any earthenware vessel, asher yipol meim el tocho. So any earthenware vessel that the dead mouse falls into it, right? And again, we're talking about just dangling it inside. So el tocho. So this is the Torah describing the earthenware vessel itself becoming tamei. It now becomes a rishon l'tumah. And now, not only that, kol asher b'tocho, anything that's inside of it, all of the cookies inside of it, every last one, yitma, is also tamei. Also tishbro, and you have to break the earthenware cookie jar, because you can't just put it in a mikvah, you have to simply break it. Now this pasuk said tocho twice, right? V'chol kli cheres asher yipol me'em el tocho. So that's the first tocho, and that is referring to the cookie jar itself becoming tamei. Kol asher bit tocho, and everything inside of it, that's the second tocho, and that's talking about everything inside of it. That's talking about the kli cheres now being metame, all of the cookies inside. Yitma, they become tamei, boso sishbo, and then you break the cookie jar. So, says the Gemara, Minan Emili, how do we know all of these halachis about the cookie jar? The Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis said tocho va'afal pi shelo noga. So we say that the cookie jar itself becomes tamei, even though the dead sheretz did not touch the cookie jar itself. Nonetheless, just dangling the dead mouse inside of the cookie jar becomes tamei. Wait, how do you know this? How do you know that simply dangling a dead mouse inside of a cookie jar, the cookie jar is tamei? Maybe it's only tamei because the dead mouse fell to the bottom of it or touched the sides of it. How do you know it's just dangling it is enough? Reb Yonasan ben Avtulmis Omer says, Reb Yonasan ben Avtulmis, Nemar tocho litamei, v'nemar tocho li tamei. As I pointed out when I read the pasuk a minute ago, the first tocho is talking about the kli cheres, the cookie jar itself becoming tamei. That is li tamei. That the dead sheretz, that is li tamei. That is the cookie jar itself becoming tamei. Li tamei. That it itself becomes tamei. And then so that's the first tocho. That's talking about the cookie jar becoming tamei. That's li tamei. That it becomes tamei. And then there is the second tocho, which is talking about the cookie jar transferring tuma to all the cookies inside, and that is litame, that it's being mitame the cookies inside of it. So again, it says nemar tocho litame. It says tocho at the end of the pasuk litame, to be mitame all the cookies. V'nemar tocho litame, and it says tocho when it's talking about the cookie jar itself becoming tame. Ma tocho ha'omer litame, just like when the second tocho you have the second tocho in the pasuk that's talking about litame, being mitame all of the cookies, afal pi shelo noga, even though it didn't touch every last cookie, and we're going to explain why in a second for the next minute or two. Let's just accept that as a given, that when the cookie jar is mitame all of the cookies inside the cookie jar, it is regardless, they don't have to be touching the jar. Right? You have a big cookie jar, lots and lots and lots and lots of chocolate chip cookies. Every person's dream until you've eaten, every child's dream, every, I think, adult's dream until they've eaten a certain amount. And then you're like, oh no, this is bad. Akoponim, and akoponim. Forget about the dreams. So you have a cookie jar, and the cookie jar is tameh. All of the cookies, of course, we're talking about an earthenware cookie jar. All of the cookies inside, even the cookie right in the middle that's surrounded by cookies, which are surrounded by other cookies, which are surrounded by other cookies, which are touching the jar. Every last cookie becomes tameh. Everything in the vessel becomes tameh, regardless of if it's touching the cookie jar, if it's physically touching the cookie jar, or if it's physically touching other cookies in the cookie jar. Everything is tameh. So just like when it comes to the cookie jar being mitame, all of the cookies inside, it's even if they are not touching. So also when we're talking about the first tocho in the pasuk, when it's talking about the dead mouse being mitame, the dead mouse being mitame, the cookie jar to become tameh, so that's li tameh, that the cookie jar is becoming tameh. So even though the dead mouse is not touching the cookie jar nonetheless becomes tameh. And how do we know that once the cookie jar becomes tameh, every last cookie becomes tameh, even the cookie that's smack in the middle, surrounded by other cookies, and that are surrounded by other cookies, etc. Rabbi Yonasan says, Atera heida al klicheres, that the Torah testified about klicheres, says Rashi dichsiv kol asher besocho, that the pasuk says everything that's inside it becomes tameh. Everything inside of the klicheres, everything, all the cookies, the cookie jar are going to become tameh. Even if the cookie jar is not filled with cookies, but it's filled with mustard seeds, little small mustard seeds. Again, every last mustard seed is going to become tameh, because the Torah says kol asher b'socho yitma, that the earthenware vessel is going to be metame every last morsel of food that is inside of it, and therefore, just like the cookie jar, moving back to cookies, just like the cookie jar is being metame all of the cookies that are inside the cookie jar, even though the jar is not touching that cookie, also so too the cookie jar becomes tameh from, right, it itself becomes tameh from the dead cherets that's merely dangling inside of it, even though the dead cherets did not actually touch anything, but even without touching, the cookie jar nonetheless becomes tameh. Let's talk a very interesting Rashi who explains why that. Let's read that. Maybe let's even read that Rashi together. It's the very top Rashi, and Daf Chafei Omid Aleph. It says, "Vafilu malei chardal." Even if the cookie jar, which for our example will be a mustard seed jar, even though mustard seed jar is all filled to the brim with mustard seeds, shakli eno nogea bichulo, that the vessel is not touching every last mustard seed. Ela b'mashe somoch lidfanos. The mustard seed jar is technically only touching the mustard seeds that are closest to the walls of the mustard seed jar. But all of the seeds in the middle, mitamin me avir mina avir, nonetheless they still become tameh just from being inside of the jar. And you can't say that, no, what's happening is actually that you can't say this. You can't say that what's happening is that the jar is becoming a rishon l'tumah, which is going to be metame the seeds that are touching the jar, and then those seeds will then be metame the next seeds, and those seeds are going to be metame the seeds that are touching them. Rashi gives 3 reasons, which is why I want to read it, because there's some interesting things over here, some important rules over here. So rule number 1, ein kibeya b'chol echad. In order for tumas ochlin, in order for food to be mitame something else, it needs to be a kibeya. It needs to be the size of a beya, of an egg. And mustard seeds are smaller than that. Ve'od, and more so, ein ochel mitame ochel. Food is not mitame other food, so you can't have one morsel of food be mitame another morsel of food. Ve'od, and more so, im kain zeh sheni v'zeh shlishi ve'ashlishi lo yaiser vi the tame iso imtsoim. And also, meaning if the jar is a rishon, right? The dead sheretz is an avatuma. The jar becomes a rishon. The first seeds that it's touching become a sheni latuma. If we're talking about truma, so then the next seeds can become a shlishi. But I mean, you can't. What about the seeds after that? So therefore, in order for us to say that all of the seeds are becoming tamei, it has to be that the simply being inside of the jar is enough to be tamei, regardless of if it is touching any tuma. Okay, that was really important stuff, by the way. Very yesodistic stuff there. Very, very important stuff there about the tuma of a klicheres only being mitami from the inside, not from the outside. When it is mitami from the inside, it is even though the sheretz is simply dangling in there and didn't actually touch anything. And then when the kli becomes tummy, it becomes a rishon l'tumah, it's then mitami all of the food that's inside of it, regardless of if it's even touching the klicheres. This is all very classic kind of tuma stuff. I'm going to take a shluck of water. We're going to go weiter. Here we go. Says the Gemara, top line of Daf Chafei Amid Aleph Amali Rav Ado bar Ahave Lirove. Says Rav Ado bar Ahave to Rove. V'yei kli cheres mitame migabo mikav v'chomer. 1 second. Why don't we make the following kal v'chomer to argue that a kli cheres should in fact become tamei from its outside? How so? Uma kol akelim she'ein mitamin me'avirin mitamin migabon. Well, all other non-klicheres vessels, which don't become tamei when a dead mouse dangles inside of them, but they do become tamei from their outside. Klicheres she'mitamin me'aviro, klicheres which is already more stringent, it becomes tamei when a dead mouse is dangling inside. Enudin she'yitamo migabo. Certainly then, let's also say that it becomes tummy from the outside as well. It's already more stringent than the others. It becomes tummy when a dead mouse is dangling inside. So certainly then, let's say it also becomes tummy when a dead mouse touches the outside. So, on my crop, this can't be because the pasuk says, V'chol kli pasuach asher ein tzomid posel olav. The pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, when in the context of tumas hames and tumas ha'oil, that if you have a corpse in a, let's just say in a tent, you have a corpse in a tent, and you know what else is in that tent? A cookie jar. V'chol kli pasuach, any vessel that is opened, asher ein samid posel olav, that its lid, somebody opened up the cookie jar to extract a cookie or two or three, and left the lid open, and then someone died in the tent. And now all of that tumas hames, the tumas oil, is going to get into the open cookie jar. Now, when we're talking about a vessel that has an opening, where does the Torah talk about vessels that shetumaso kodemes lepischo, that the tuma precedes? Right? Is that simply right that once the tuma enters into the vessel, it immediately already becomes tamei even before it touched anything? Right? So tumaso kodemes lepischo, that once the tuma goes inside of it, it already immediately becomes tamei. Is that klicheres? Of course, klicheres that we've been talking about, the cookie jar. We said if the dead sheretz, once it even goes inside of it, it already becomes tamei. So when we're talking about a kli pasuach, an open vessel, a vessel that tuma can get into, so we're talking about earthenware vessels, where once tuma gets into it, it immediately becomes tamei. V'chi ein tzomid posel olav hu ditamei, and what the pasuk is saying by the tumas oil, that when there is no lid on it, when it is open, that is when it becomes tamei, because that is when the tuma gets inside of it. Right? The pasuk specifically says v'chol kli pasuach asher ein tzomid posel olav, that when the vessel is open, and therefore tuma can get inside of it, that is when it becomes tamei. Hayesh tzamid pasel olav, but if it was closed, if it was sealed, and it was in that oil, and there's a corpse in the oil amaze, and there is a closed, sealed cookie jar, no tuma will get in, and it will be tahor, even though it's surrounded by tuma. It does not become tummy from the outside. Okay, so we're saying, okay, so ayesh tzamid pasel olav tahor. Right, so we wanted to suggest that, well, maybe a kli cheres should become tummy from the outside, right? Because after all, it's already become tummy from the inside. Certainly it should become tummy from the outside, like all the other vessels. Say no, because we have a pasuk that specifically says that when it comes to kli cheres, so long as it's closed, it won't become tummy. It won't become tummy from the outside. Only if it's open can it become tummy from the inside, but not tummy from the outside. Frag the Gemara. But why don't we suggest that all of the other vessels, like our silver cookie jar, maybe if you dangle a dead mouse into our silver cookie jar, let's say that the jar should become tameh and all the cookies. If when it comes to a kli cheres that we just established, it cannot become tameh from its outside, mitame me'aviro, and yet when it comes to dangling a dead mouse inside, it'll become tameh. So then all of the other vessels which are more stringent, they can become tameh even from the outside. Certainly, I would argue, certainly dangling a dead cheretz inside of our silver cookie jar, certainly it should become a whole mess, should become tameh, all of the cookies and everything. After all, if the dead cheretz touches even the outside of the silver cookie jar, it'll already create a situation of tumah. So I would argue, certainly dangling it inside should also be mitame. The pasuk says by the kli cheres, by the earthenware cookie jar, tocho, inside it, tocho shel zeh v'lo tocho shel acher, inside inside the earthenware cookie jar. That is when there is tumah, not in a different scenario, not in a silver cookie jar, for example. Okay, and when it comes to these tochos, we make the following drasha when it comes to that pasuk by a kli cheres that mentions tocho twice, as we have learnt about. It says tocho 4 times. Now, didn't we say that it says tocho 2 times? We did, because it does say tocho 2 times. However, the Gemara darshans, it could technically say toch. It doesn't need to say tocho. So therefore, we can learn out from toch as well as from tocho. So tocho, toch, tocho, toch. We could learn out from tocho and toch times 2 because it says tocho twice. Chad legufe. One of them, we simply need to teach us that the kli cheres is mitame all of the cookies. That once the cookie jar becomes tameh, it is mitame all of the cookies. V'chad l'gzeira shava, and one for the gzeira shava that we learned earlier, that it says tocho by the cookie jar being mitame all of the cookies, and it says tocho by the cookie jar itself becoming tameh. Just like when it says tocho by the cookie jar being mitame all of the cookies, even if the cookies are not touching the cookie jar. So also the cookie jar itself becomes tameh, even though it's not touching the dangling mouse. That was the gzeira shava that we had learned earlier. So we've used up 2 tochos so far. One to teach that the cookie jar is mitame all the cookies. The other one is to teach that the cookie jar itself becomes tameh, even though it's not touching the dead cheretz. V'chad tocho shel zeh v'lo tocho shel acher. One of the things that we learn is what we just learned now, that only a kli cheres is mitame from inside, not other vessels. The silver cookie jar would not become tameh when a dead mouse is dangling inside of it. And finally, v'chad tocho v'lo tocho ve'afilu kli shetef matzil. Friends, what does this mean? So interestingly, I'm going to take a shluck of water and we'll go weiter. Interestingly, I was actually learning about something very similar yesterday. I'm learning now Masechta Kelim in Mishnayos. We're learning about klei cheres. Now, Taka learned a very similar Mishnah yesterday. So I have a diagram actually for this. I made here a diagram. So this diagram is about a vessel in a vessel. It's not 3D, it's 2D, but I will try and walk you through what is going on here. So what you see here, you have on the left is a side view and on the right is a bird's eye view. So we're going to kind of oscillate between the side view and the bird's eye view in order to hopefully understand this. So from the side view, what you're looking at, well, maybe even from the bird's eye view first. For now, you can ignore the mouse and the cheese. So in terms of the bird's eye view, what you are looking at is the golden square represents a larger earthenware vessel. And the red square represents a smaller, it doesn't necessarily have to be earthenware vessel, but let's say a smaller vessel that is inside of the larger vessel. So imagine you have like a box, an earthenware box, okay, that's open at the top. And inside of the earthenware box, there's a smaller earthenware box. So it's a box within a box. Now, if you go to the side view, what you see is that the inner box, the red box, is taller than the outer box, than the gold box. Okay, so you have a red box that's inside of a gold box. So the gold box is the larger box. The red box is a smaller box that's inside of the larger box. And it is taller, the inner box is taller than the outer box. Now inside the inner box, as you can see, there is cheese. There is some food inside of the inner box. Now in the outer box, there is a dead mouse that is dangling inside, right? Is dangling in the outer box. And the question is, you have this dead mouse that's dangling inside the outer box. The outer box is a klei cheres. And as we've just been learning, that a klei cheres is mitame mitocho, right? So I would think, I can argue, or I could think, that you have this dead mouse is being dangled inside of the outer, in the gold box, in the outer klei cheres, which means that the klei cheres certainly becomes tameh. And we also said that everything inside of it becomes tameh as well. So the question is, does that mean that the red vessel, along with the food that's inside of it, becomes tameh as well? So we say, tocho velo toch tocho. That, right, as we've been describing up until now, a cookie jar, that you dangle a dead mouse inside of the cookie jar. So yes, all of the cookies that are inside the cookie jar will become tameh, because all of the cookies inside the cookie jar are going to become tameh, because they're inside the cookie jar. The cookie jar is now tameh. It's going to be tameh all of the cookies. However, the pasuk in Vayikra, I think it was in Parsha Shmini, that describes, right, that with the tocho, the two tochos, it says that we say that davka ochel becomes tameh in a klei cheres. Cookies in a cookie jar become tameh in a klei cheres. A vessel that's inside of a klei cheres does not become tameh. Therefore, our red vessel that's inside of our golden vessel, meaning, well, obviously, when I say red and golden, it's not made out of red and made out of gold. They're earthenware vessels. Maybe they're painted gold or whatever. But I obviously just have the colors to distinguish between the two. So a klei cheres is metame food that's inside of it, not vessels that are inside of it, and therefore the red vessel is not going to become tameh, and that's regardless of if the red vessel is made out of earthenware or anything else. Again, as we said, the klicheres is going to be mitame ochel that's inside of it, not kalim. So therefore, the red vessel remains tahor, and the food that's inside the red vessel remains tahor as well. So amazing. Okay, great. So that's what we're saying. So we're saying tocho velo tocho, that the cookie jar is mitame what's inside of it. However, if inside the cookie jar there was another jar, and inside that jar there were cookies, so then the tuma of the outer cookie jar would not be mitame any of the cookies in the inner cookie jar, since the inner cookie jar would be tahor, because the outer cookie jar would not be able to be mitame the inner cookie jar because it's a vessel, right? Klicheres can only be mitame ochlin, not kalim. Okay. So now, so therefore, right, so we said, right, tocho velo tocho, that the klicheres is mitame what's inside of it, not what is inside a vessel that's inside of it. Vafilu klei shetef matzil, and even a non-klicheres can protect the food that is inside of it. So even if that red vessel was made out of silver or whatever, still the food that was inside the vessel would remain tahor. Okay, now, v'lo you call akelim mitamin migavan. Let's argue that all of the other vessels should not become tamei from their outside. Right? Klicheres is not mitame migabo, is not mitame from the outside. Maybe other vessels also do not become tamei from outside. V'lo you call akelim mitamin migabon, ela mitochan, only from the inside, uvenegia, and when they touch the dead mouse, right? Because we already established that the other vessels would not become tummy from the, right, just dangling a dead mouse inside of them. So if a dead mouse goes inside a silver cookie jar, it would have to touch the cookie jar. And let's say that that's it. In terms of if a dead mouse touches the outside of a silver cookie jar, maybe it remains tahor. If a klicheres, which can become tummy from dangling on the inside, does not become tummy on its outside, the other vessels which do not become tummy when a dead mouse is dangling inside of it, they should also not become tummy on the outside. They seem to be more lenient than klicheres. The pasuk says, "V'chol kli pasuach asher ein samid pasil alav tamei hu." So that pasuk that talks about the open jar, right, the klicheres, that when it's open in the olam it becomes tummy, but when it's closed it does not, i.e. it only becomes tummy from the inside but not from the outside. It says hu. Hi hu, so hi hu, specifically by earthenware vessels, dechi ein tzamid pasul olav tamei hayesh tzamid pasul olav tahor. It's a specific halacha to earthenware vessels that when they are opened and the tumah can get in, they become tamei, but when they are closed, they do not become tamei from the outside. Hakol akelim, but all other vessels, bein sheish tzamid pasul aleim, bein she'ein tzamid pasul aleim, whether they are closed or whether they are opened, it makes no difference. Mitamin, they will become tamei. They can become tamei from the inside, from the outside, but of course, when it comes to other vessels, they would only become tamei if the dead sheretz actually touches the vessel, not just dangling, but they would also become tamei from the outside of the vessel. Okay, so that was the first Mishnah of today's daf, where we were comparing klicheres to other types of vessels in terms of their ability to contract and convey tumah. And now we compare wooden vessels to metal vessels. Tar b'klei eitz, tami b'klei matechos, that which is tahor by wooden vessels, pshute klei eitz. When you have a wooden vessel with no receptacle, it is tahor. Why is that so? That is so because the pasuk says, I think in Parshas Shmini, I'm reading you a pasuk, yipol olav meim b'mosam yitma, anything that a dead sheretz falls on becomes tamei. Michol kli eitz, wood, or beged, garments, or hide, sack, or a sack, a knapsack. Okay, etc. So we compare all of these materials, including wood, holz, to a sack. Just like a sack, a knapsack is something that you put stuff in it. So also when we're talking about tumah for wood, we're talking about something that you're going to put something in, like a box or something like that. But if it's what's called pshute kle'etz, just like a slab of wood, some wood that doesn't have any base kibul, although there is an exception for like a table, something that I think you could put on it, I think vessels and food, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, tables are kind of a different thing. But if you have like I don't know what's a pshute kle'etz, I don't know, a stick or something like that, I guess, would not be tamei. So tahor b'kle'etz, so that which is tahor by wooden vessels, pshute kle'etz, tamei b'klei matechos are tamei when it comes to metal. Pshute klei matechos, just a stam piece of metal, can become tamei. Tahor b'klei matechos, but that which is tahor by metal, as we're going to see in a minute in the Gemara, for example, vessels that are not quite finished. For example, if you're making like a jewelry box out of metal, the assumption is that making something out of metals, let's say silver. Okay, let's say a silver jewelry box. So that is kind of a fancier type of thing, and there it's only going to be considered complete, and we're going to explain why in the Gemara, but it's only to be considered complete once the final touches have been put on it. That even though it's fully functional, you've created the box, you can open it, you can close it, but you haven't finished designing it the way that you want it, it's not going to be able to become tamei yet. So tahor b'klei matechos, that which is tahor by klei matechos, like these vessels that are functionally complete, but not completely complete, not emotionally complete. Tamei b'klei etz, yet by wooden vessels that would, once it's functionally complete, it is already able to become tamei. So let's read that again. Tahor b'klei etz, that which is tahor by wooden vessels, pshute klei etz, that don't have a receptacle, tamei b'klei matechos would be tamei by metal vessels. Pshute klei matechos would be able to become tamei. Tahor b'klei matechos, that which is tahor by metal vessels, for example, if it's functionally complete but not yet completely complete, not emotionally complete, I'll call it, which means like the final touches haven't yet been put on it. So tamei b'klei etz. So it's tahor by klei matechos, but by klei etz it would be tamei already once it is functionally complete. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbi's thought, says the Gemara, golmei klei etz tmein, that these functionally complete wooden vessels, let's say you're making a jewelry box out of wood, once it is functionally complete, it can already become tamei. Pshutei and tahorin, but pshutei klei etz are tahor. Golmei klei matechos, now functionally complete metal vessels, tahorim, are still tahor. They are not mikabel tumah. They're considered incomplete still. Pshutei and tmein, and pshutei klei matechos can become tamei. Nimtza tahor b'klei etz. So what we see is that which is tahor by klei etz, pshutei klei etz, tamei b'klei matechos are tamei by metals. Pshutei klei matechos can become tamei. Tahor b'klei matechos, that which is tahor by metals, functionally complete metals, but not emotionally complete metals, right? Metal vessels that are metal that are functionally complete but not emotionally complete. Tamei b'klei etz are tamei by a wooden vessel. Ve'elu ein golmei klei etz. Now here are examples of golmei klei etz. Here are examples of wooden vessels that are functionally complete but not emotionally complete. Kol she'osid lashuf. For example, if it still needs to be polished, right? Let's just use the example of a jewelry box. A wooden jewelry box versus a silver jewelry box. So you make a wooden jewelry box and you still need to polish it. So it's functionally complete, but you still need to polish it. The shabetz, or to put in to stud it. I don't know, maybe you want to put on, I don't know, little eyeballs. Maybe you want to paste glue eyeballs onto it. I don't know, what do you want to, I don't know, what do you want to stud on it? What do you want to stud on it? Maybe like different interesting rocks or something like that. Ich weiß nicht. Weiß ich nicht. Ligarer, or maybe you want to still even flatten it out with a plane. Licharkev, or maybe you want to kind of make indentations that go around it, like some kind of like a molding kind of thing, just etch, just like some designs, kind of etch some designs around it. Le'atiach betunis, or to sand it with some kind of fish skin. Muchusar kain, or maybe its base, it doesn't have a proper base yet. Ogen, or maybe if it's like a cup or something like that, it doesn't have a proper lip yet. Ozen, or a handle, tummy. In all of these scenarios, the vessel can already become tummy because it is considered to be functionally complete. Mechusar chatita tahor. Now, if it's missing a receptacle, however, then it is tahor. Mechusar chatita pshita. Well, obviously, if it has no receptacle, it is tahor. It's pshute klei eitz. That's tahor. As we said, we compare it to a sack. It has to be able to hold something. Lo tzricha dechok kapiza bikava. Well, that's correct. If it has no receptacle at all, it's obvious that it would be tahor. It's talking about a scenario where the plan was to make a receptacle that can hold a full kav, can hold a kav of, let's say, figs or whatever. However, you haven't completed making the receptacle. At this point, it can only hold 3/4 of a kav of figs. So because it would be considered not yet functionally complete since you haven't yet made the vessel the way you intend to make it, so that would be tahor. Okay, fine. Ve'elu gome klei matechos, and here are the metal vessels that are functionally complete but not emotionally complete. Kol she'asid lashuf, anything that is you intend in the future to I believe in this case it's like to smooth it out. It's interesting. We're gonna have like many of the same words from the wood, but it's like slightly different when it comes to metal. But yeah, lashuf I think was also so by wood we said it's to polish it. Here I think it's to kind of like sand it down because yeah. The shabetz, in this case, it's still to stud. Maybe you want to add like diamonds to it or something. Ligarer was, I think, in this case, still to plane it. I think it's to still even it out. I think. Licharker, this was like to add the design. Maybe you want to etch designs into it. Lakish bekornis, maybe now I got to give it an extra knock to even things out. Mechusar kain, or maybe it's missing a base, or ogen, or a lip, or ozen, or a handle. Tahor. In all of these cases, the metal vessel will be tahor because it is not emotionally complete. Mechusar kisui tamei, but if it's missing a lid, it is tamei because the lid is considered a separate kli. Even without the lid, you can still consider this vessel to be complete, and it will be makabel tuma. Mashnahani umashnahani. How come by wooden vessels, once they are functionally complete, they are makabel tuma, and by metal vessels, they are not makabel tuma until they are emotionally complete? Rabbi Yochanan Omer says, Rabbi Yochanan, the difference is that a metal vessel is more honorable. Right, you give it as a gift. You may a silver jewelry box. You can give as a proper gift, and because it's something that you give as a gift, that is meant to be something that is beautiful, something that is special. So it is only makabel tuma once it reaches that point. Once it's as an emotional, enough emotional value that you put on all the final touches, masha'ein kain by a wooden vessel. Rav Nachman says, similar but different, because it's expensive. Since a silver jewelry box is much more expensive than a wooden jewelry box, so therefore it's only going to be mikabel tuma once it is, once it can justify, once it becomes expensive. right? Once all the final touches are on there and it's perfect, and right, without all the final touches, it's not ready. It can't demand the price that it's meant to demand. But because we're talking about something expensive, so only once it has all of its final touches on it, at that point, it becomes tamei. My benai, what's the nafkamina between whether it's a kind of an honorable thing? I feel like there's a better word for that, but whether it's something that's just kind of a special vessel versus something that's an expensive vessel. Ikebenayu clay etzem, bone vessels made out of bone, because vessels made out of bone are expensive, but they aren't special. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, they would become tamei already once they're functionally complete, since they are not special. Whereas according to Rav Nachman, since they are expensive, they would only become tamei once they are emotionally complete. Rav Nachman is consistent with his ruling. To Amar Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman, klei etzem kichlei matechos damu, that bone vessels are like metal vessels. Since they are expensive, they have the same halachas, and they will only be makabel tuma once they are emotionally complete. Michlal dechlei etzem mekable tuma. Wait, so we're assuming then that bone vessels are in fact mekabel tuma? Yes, we are. Desani, we learn in the Brayso, Rabbi Shmuel beno Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Mata maloma v'chol maise izim tischato. How come the pasuk says? What does it mean when the pasuk says v'chol maise izim? Things made from goats you shall purify. L'havi davar abot mina izim, to include that which comes from goats, min akarnaim, for example, from the horns, min tlafayim, or from the hooves. They would also require purification. They can become tamei. They require purification. And how do we know that other animals and wild animals, their vessels made from their bones can also become tamei? Tamulomar v'chol maise izim. Doesn't just say izim, says v'chol maise, to include also other animals. Imkima tamulomar izim. Then why specify anything at all? Why say goats? Prad ofus, to exclude birds. Any vessels made from bird claws, those would not become tamei. And finally, we arrive at the third and final Mishnah of today's daf, comparing sweet almonds to bitter almonds. Says the Mishnah, achayev b'shkedim amorim, that which is chayev in trumas hamaisus when it comes to bitter almonds, potter b'mesukim, is going to be potter by sweet almonds. Achayev b'mesukim, that which is chayev in trumas hamaisus by sweet almonds, potter b'morim, is potter when it comes to bitter almonds. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, shkedim amorim ketanim chayavim gedolim keturin, when it comes to bitter almonds, when they are small and not yet bitter, they're chayiv in trumas hamaisus. Once they are big and bitter and nobody wants to eat them, so then they are potter from trumas hamaisus. Misukim, when it comes to sweet almonds, it's the opposite. Gedolim, when they're big and gishmak, chayav, and they're chayiv in trumas hamaisus, ketanim peturim, but when they are small, they are potter. Bishma Reb Yossi, Omer says Bishma Reb Yossi, Mishum Av, the name of his father Reb Yossi, zeh vozeh liftor. Whether we're talking about sweet or bitter almonds, when they are small, they are potter. V'amrila, those who say zev v'zeh l'chiyuv, that whether we're talking about sweet or bitter almonds, when they are big, they are chayiv. Amr Reb Ila, says Reb Ila, horror Reb Chanina b'tzipori, kedivrei Omer zeh v'zeh liftor. Reb Chanina paskind in tzipori, like the opinion that whether bitter, whether sweet, they are potter when they are small. Now, according to the opinion who said that whether sweet, whether bitter, they are chayav trumas hamaisus when they are big, what is big, bitter almonds good for? They're just bitter, aren't they? So, or, well, you could sweeten them up with fire, I guess, roast them or something, and they can become sweet. They will become sweeter, and then that is why they will be chayiv in trumas hamaisus even when the bitter almonds are big, because you can sweeten them by roasting them. Friends, that was Daf Chof A, Daf 25 of Masechta Chullin. On Daf 25 of Masechta Chullin, we learned 3 Mishnayos. The first Mishnah, we compared earthenware vessels to other vessels. We talked about some of the details, some of the unique details of earthenware vessels for example, they don't become tummy from their outside. They can, however, become tummy even when a dead mouse is simply dangled inside of it, even though it didn't touch anything. The earthenware cookie jar that we were talking about will become tummy just when a mouse is dangled inside of it, and all of the cookies, or we saw an example of mustard seeds, everything, all the food inside of it will become tummy. We did see an interesting scenario where, right, we had a jar, a vessel that was inside of a vessel, and we said in that case, any of the food inside the inner vessel will remain tahor because, right, it says mikola ochel asher yochel, that only in the case of the cookie jar, right, you have the cookie jar becomes tummy, then all the cookies in it become tummy. But vessels that are inside of earthenware vessels remain tahor. Only food, only cookies, only mustard seeds, food that's inside of the earthenware vessel, that becomes tummy, but not vessels inside a vessel. Therefore, if you have a vessel inside a vessel and you have food inside the inner vessel, it will remain tahor. Now, other non-klicheres vessels, they do become tameh from their outside, and they don't become tameh when a dead mouse is dangled inside of them. We learned another Mishnah comparing wooden vessels to metal vessels. We said that by wooden vessels, when they are pshute kle'etz, they are tahor, but when they are made into a vessel that is functionally complete, even though it's not what we were calling emotionally complete, it's tameh. The opposite is true by metal vessels. Pshute klei matechos can become tameh. However, when making them to vessel, for example, a jewelry box or something, it will remain tahor until the final touches have been put on it. The question was, why is that? Rabbi Yochanan said, because they are special. A metal vessel is something that's made to be special, and for that reason, it can become tameh once the final touches have been put on it. Reb Nachman said it's because they are expensive. And nafkamina was, what about a vessel made out of bone, which is expensive but not special? Rabbi Yochanan would say it would become tameh once it can become tameh once it is functionally complete. Rabbi Nachman would say it can only become tameh once it is emotionally complete, once all the final touches has been put on it. And finally, we compared sweet almonds to bitter almonds. There was one perspective that bitter almonds are, right, the Mishnah had said bitter almonds, when they are small, they're chayv in trumas and ma'asos because they can be eaten them, but once they are big, they're too bitter and nobody eats them, they're pater from trumas and ma'asos. And the opposite is true by sweet almonds. When they are small, they are pater, but when they are big, they are chayv. We saw the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel quoting his father Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi quoting his father Rabbi Yossi. One version of it was that either way, sweet, bitter, when they're small, you don't separate trumas and ma'asos. The other opinion was that sweet, bitter, when they're big, you do separate trumas and ma'asos. What are big, bitter almonds good for? You could heat them up. You can roast them and they'll sweeten up. Friends, have a great day. I hope you enjoyed Daf Chafei of Masechta Chullin. Cheers.